Bloodborne is one of my favorite games of the last decade, and I highly recommend it to everyone who's a fan of the action role-playing genre. Compared to Dark Souls, which has slower and more deliberate combat, Bloodborne is much faster paced. The rally mechanic, which allows the player to regain a portion of their HP after they've been hit by an enemy attack, adds a surprising layer of depth to the action by encouraging players to take more risks and rewarding greed over self-preservation. This leads to more high-tension moments as players have to make split decisions on whether they should press the advantage or back away. It ties nicely into the lore of the game, where the best hunters appear indistinguishable from bloodthirsty beasts or madmen, and the player character may not seem any different when they continue attacking defeated foes to rally back their lost HP. It was probably unintentional, but this also makes it easy to tell new players apart from veteran hunters by watching how well they utilize the rally mechanic. The lines between gameplay and storytelling are wonderfully blurred, and the inclusion of insight with nightmares and dreamscapes really sells the idea that the world you're in can be twisted by your perspective of it, and that something sinister could always be lurking around the corner. It would have been nicer if insight had a larger role, since many players may not even be aware of what it changes, but it still manages to feel relevant, adds a lot of flavor, and arguments could be made that less is more with its implementation. Bloodborne does a nice job building on Dark Souls without borrowing too much from the formula. For example, limb breaks improve on tail breaks since they open enemies to extra attacks, making it so that there's more incentive to target different sections of an enemy's body. This adds an extra layer of complexity to certain encounters, and gives players more agency in choosing how they want to fight the enemy. Conversely, backstabs aren't as easy to employ, but parrying is somewhat easier since it can be done at range, and visceral attacks more than live up to their name. Firearms may be somewhat weaker than one would expect, and play more of a support role to melee combat. With most hunter tools found later in the game, players who are more familiar with the ranged caster role in Dark Souls may struggle initially and find Bloodborne to be more encumbersome, difficult, or restrictive as a result. Because it focuses on faster, more intent melee combat, it can be a challenge for new players and veterans of the Souls series to make the transition into diving headfirst into battle. Bloodborne's skill floor is respectably low with co-op, and has a relatively modest skill ceiling, leaving players plenty of room to grow. Trick weapons really highlight this, as it's possible to complete the game without transforming them at all, but highly skilled players will maximize the potential of their weapons, transforming them on the fly in combination attacks to take down their prey. Transformation attacks really help Bloodborne stand apart from the other Souls games, and the versatility of trick weapons makes each one feel more viable in clearing the game compared to the standard weapons of Dark Souls. One of Bloodborne's major flaws is its item economy. The game offers a robust variety of weapons to choose from, but the limited access to upgrade materials makes it too tedious, expensive, or time-consuming to farm for them, especially when including blood vials into the cost of progression. Quite often, by the time one gets a new weapon, it takes too much effort to upgrade it to be viable for the current area, so it inadvertently funnels players into using more early-game weapons, especially if they've been upgrading their firearms. Stat requirements also play a role in restricting access to some weapons, and others aren't even attainable until the game's virtually beaten. This wouldn't be as big an issue if players could drop items between themselves, but since they can't, some weapons are only really viable in New Game Plus. While this adds replayability, and I think it's perfectly valid to have some items locked behind story progression, I also really enjoyed the feeling of strengthening my weapon as I played the game. Because of the way New Game Plus scales, it really only makes sense to use a +9 or +10 weapon to begin with, so you don't really get the same sense of progression, and it takes some of the enjoyment away from me. If I could, I'd add a New Game Minus option where the player could start the game completely from scratch again, but be able to select any weapon as a gift from the messengers in the Hunter's Dream. But that's not too important, really. Compared to Dark Souls, which allows a player to heal a limited amount for free each life, blood vials need to be found or purchased from the shop. I have mixed feelings about this, because it makes sense from a lore perspective that our supply of blood would be limited, but I can't really defend how their prices scale higher throughout the game. Truthfully, if one plays well, they can rely on rallying and looting blood vials from enemies, and they won't need to buy more, but for newer or low-skill players, having to purchase blood vials creates these awkward breakpoints where they need to farm for more if they run out. This wouldn't be as big an issue if enemies respawn automatically upon visiting a lantern, but it gets compounded when players need to use bold hunter's marks which cost more echoes, or sit through 2 loading screens each time they just want to farm a few more enemies. Since players who need to farm are struggling already, there's a chance they could lose their echoes in the process, adding salt into the wound, but I guess that's part of the price in learning to get good. This bleeds into purchasing other items as well. While many aren't individually expensive, the cost for leveling and buying more blood vials make purchasing different armor, weapons, and consumables feel prohibitively expensive, or even a waste at times if the player doesn't use them. Additionally, Some items have a limited amount that can be obtained, so if they're misused, the player can be doubly punished for their misplays by not being able to obtain more. Some of these issues could have been avoided by allowing players to save multiple files or letting them save manually. Of course, it could be argued that this would diminish the weight of the player's choices, but honestly, with players already being able to manually export and reload their save files, it just feels overly draconian and restrictive not having more options available. I've heard others say these are all optional things that can be more or less completely ignored by playing the game well, but this criticism exposes one of the core issues of how items are implemented. If they can be ignored, why even have them in the game? Obviously the answer is so there can be more variety, but my point is that variety is really only accessible to veterans because of their associated costs. And again, if playing the game well means these items can be ignored, there's even less incentive to use them. It makes purchasing consumables kind of a noob trap since they have the most to gain from using them, but they're probably better off just leveling up or purchasing more blood vials and quicksilver bullets instead. This isn't to say other items don't have value or they shouldn't be purchased at all, but it's just that they're too expensive to be of practical use to those who need them the most. Bloodborne's story is pretty bare bones, so it can be treated purely as an action arcade style game. However, Bloodborne doesn't do the best job establishing why the player needs to go out on the hunt, so many are left confused by the game sequence of events. Fortunately, the subject matter of the game suits how vague it is, so portions of the game that feel incomplete still feel thematically relevant. At times, Bloodborne's lore is too vague for its own good, and players need to rely on external sources like developer interviews for more information. This is a pretty big design flaw in my opinion, and ideally players could come to a basic understanding of the text just by playing the game, but translation issues also impact the story, and unsightly portions of the Japanese text were revised during development and not updated into the other languages, making it more difficult to approach. Nonetheless, the lore and its underlying mechanics are woven together so well it's a little mind-boggling, and I often wonder how much was intentional versus mere coincidence. It has some of the most impressive world building I've ever seen, but it's buried so deep beneath the surface, it's nearly inscrutable and mostly held together by headcanon. This can be a good and a bad thing since people are going to be attached to their own ideas about the lore, but for those who want more concrete details, very little is ever definitive. Because so little is spelled out, it encourages people to look to others for answers, but with a way to tell good lore from bad lore being already knowing the lore, many become unwittingly misled by fan theories which aren't supported by the text. Honestly, the required base game content is pretty short, but the optional content really fleshes it out. I'd highly recommend getting the Old Hunters DLC since it has some of the best content FromSoft has produced, with amazing boss fights and compelling areas. The only real downside of the DLC is how much it outscales the base game, making the final sections feel a bit lackluster in comparison. Bloodborne has multiple endings, so wanting to see all three can increase replayability, though it can be tedious having to replay through the entire game again with the way each new game plus cycle scales in difficulty. Some of the monotony could have been reduced with the ability to respec characters or a better save system, especially since you get thrust into New Game Plus automatically and can't return to previous areas. It's a little bizarre respecking isn't an option since it was in Dark Souls 2, and it may have been planned to be in the Hunter's Dream at one point, but not having it really makes the game feel more restrictive than it needs to be. Part of the issue is you can't make informed choices about what to build or use on a first playthrough, so it forces players to either look at a guide or rely on trial and error to figure out what they like. This affects PvP the most. Because many players will naturally want to try different weapons on a first playthrough, they'll spread their stats to accommodate various stat requirements and reduce their viability in PvP as a result. FromSoft often tries to walk a fine line in allowing players freedom to interact with the world versus making the consequences of their action have weight, but not being able to reallocate your stats feels overly restrictive or punishing when you can't make informed choices to begin with. To be fair, being unable to respec isn't necessarily a problem, but it would be the simplest solution to other systemic issues. For example, stat requirements on equipment are fairly arbitrary and could be changed along with damage scaling values, but these would take a lot of work to change. As it is right now, players need to make multiple characters for different builds. When you factor how much additional time and RNG is needed to farm blood gems and chalice dungeons, it can be downright brutal having to farm for multiple characters or abandon a character you've already farmed gems on because you don't like their stats. Then again, if the blood gem situation were improved and wasn't reliant on RNG, there'd be less need or incentive to respec characters. PvP in general is a bit of a mess compared to Dark Souls because of how much farming is required to be competitively viable, and the areas one can freely invade are very limited, so you're more likely to be outnumbered by the host and their cooperators if you invade in other locations. The net play is also pretty terrible, so it's not uncommon to be struck by attacks that didn't connect visually, and it's very jarring to get shot by bullets that have already flown past your character. That being said, while its focus is pretty limited, there are quite a few people who still enjoy PvP, but it's not for me. As for the game direction, Bloodborne does a better job of incorporating cutscenes into its storytelling, and the transitions between scenes generally feel smoother and more cinematic than previous titles, and do an appropriate job for setting the tone for each scene. Camera controls and locking on are also much smoother than previous games, though there are still moments in close quarters where it feels like you're fighting the camera rather than the enemy. This is really the exception rather than the rule though, so it's unfortunate there's a camera boss fairly early in the game. Level design is superb in the early portions of the game, and Central Yharnam is one of the best tutorial areas I've seen in a video game. It introduces a variety of enemy types, rewards players for exploring, and teaches players to stay vigilant and pay attention to their surroundings. Multiple packs of enemies make the area suitably challenging, and are meant to teach players there are times to hang back and proceed with caution, and times to dive headfirst into the action. It manages expectations of what's to come extremely well, and clearly establishes we're not in Lordran anymore. While the later levels aren't bad, they're somewhat smaller and more disjointed than the beginning areas, so they end up feeling a little sparse in comparison. Even so, the DLC does a fantastic job fitting them into the narrative of the game, so that even if they seem disconnected at first, they all still feel as though they fit into the world of Bloodborne. Going back to Chalice dungeons, they're completely optional content with a ton of replayability. They have a wide variety of unique enemies and bosses, setting them apart from the base game, and can be pretty nerve-wracking or intense depending on your level the first time you go into them. Despite this, they become a bit too repetitive due to how many layers need to be explored to complete the story dungeons. While the Chalices have issues, I respect FromSoft's attempts at trying something new, realizing it didn't work as well as they would have liked, and not trying to force it down our throats in future titles. As such, I tend to view them more as icing on the cake of Bloodborne. They're pretty good in moderation, but you wouldn't want the whole cake or game to be made out of it. I mentioned it briefly earlier, but it bears repeating. One of the major issues with FromSoft games in general is they can be a bit too cryptic for their own good, practically requiring the player to look at a guide to figure things out. Things don't necessarily need to be spelled out, but I'd argue their games would be better if they took more time to set up or foreshadow things, or worked on integrating things to feel more natural or organic to gameplay. The way we access the DLC is kind of emblematic of this, where it feels as though it's introduced at a pretty random portion of the game, and very little ties it into the main story. Of course, this can be argued as a positive thing by those who enjoy things being vague and discovering them on their own, but I still think the execution could have used refinement. Even though Bloodborne is one of my favorite games of the last decade, I won't turn a blind eye to its issues. If I were to rank it on a bell curve of 1 to 10, with 1 being terrible, 5 being average yet enjoyable, and 10 being the absolute pinnacle of gaming with no flaws, I'd give Bloodborne an 8 out of 10. It's a great experience offering solid gameplay with a high degree of replayability. For fans of Gothic literature and Victorian design, it's an almost perfect homage to authors like Mary Shelley and H.P. Lovecraft, and can provide hours upon hours of entertainment. To recap and help justify my score, here's a quick list of pros and cons, starting with the pros. It has excellent combat that emphasizes risk versus reward, a low skill floor with a high skill ceiling, a diverse set of weapons, a hub world for easy shopping and quick access between areas, an amazing atmosphere with great worlds and level design, really cool enemies, tons of hidden and optional content including Chalice dungeons, a high degree of replayability with New Game Plus and challenge runs, multiplayer cooperation, and it generally feels like its own experience when compared to Dark Souls. As for the cons, the item economy is really bad with item pricing and availability. Some supplies are woefully limited in certain sections of the game, and slow loading screens make farming for items painfully slow and tedious. It's too cryptic for its own good at times, forcing players to look at secondary sources for information. PvP suffers due to invasion mechanics, gem farming, and net play issues. There is no way to respec your character, and only being able to autosave feels unnecessarily restrictive. Some builds have slow starts that require a lot of planning or knowledge to work. And finally, the game is for PlayStation 4 only, requiring PS Plus for online features, meaning you can't do root chalices without it. Generally, Bloodborne shares many of the same issues as Dark Souls, but I think its combat, world building, and aesthetics are more cohesive overall. None of the negatives are particularly game-breaking, but the game could have been that much better if they were addressed. Hopefully this review has given you a better understanding or appreciation for Bloodborne and more insight into how I rate games. As I said, it's one of my favorite games of the decade, and I've spent more hours than I care to admit analyzing its story and lore, so I definitely feel as though I've gotten my money's worth playing it. So how do you feel about Bloodborne? Do you agree with or disagree with anything I've said? What score would you give it? Be sure to let me know in the comment section. If you're interested in learning more about Bloodborne and its lore, I've got more videos on my channel, a few lore-throughs, and a Discord server filled with people who love to discuss lore. The link is in the video description. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. And special thank you to all my patrons, channel members, viewers, commenters, and subscribers. I appreciate it. Your continued support makes it easier to produce these kinds of videos, and I look forward to making more. Until next time, LastProtagonist out.